A village in the mountains has been suffering constant attacks from an S-rank Fenrir, so they spent all of their savings to hire an SS-rank party to defeat it. The members of Flaming Dragon Fang are some of the strongest adventurers in the world, each with their own unique strengths. But then there's Kurt, and all he's good for is doing chores, so he's hiding behind a wall to avoid getting hurt. However, Kurt is the first person the Fenrir attacks once it arrives, and he is sent flying. The other members of the party get ready for combat. Galnova orders Bandana to restrain the Fenrir, so she pulls out her wire and ties it up. But a second later, the Fenrir breaks her back against the wall. Normally, Bandana would be confined to a wheelchair for the rest of her life, but with Malphus on the team, she's healed within seconds and gets back to work. She uses a tree to anchor herself to the ground, giving Galnova an opening to aim for the Fenrir's head. He jumps up and sets it ablaze with his magic sword. The villagers are so happy about the Fenrir's defeat that they prepare a feast for the party, even though the village is almost broke. But Galnova absolutely hates this peasant food. He orders Kurt to prepare a decent meal for him instead, and Bandana asks him to make something special because today is the last day they are going to get to eat Kurt's cooking. Kurt doesn't understand what they mean by that, so he asks Galnova for an explanation, and he tells Kurt that, as of today, he is being fired. Kurt doesn't understand why they are firing him, so he asks Galnova if he did something wrong, but Galnova says the problem is that Kurt isn't doing enough. Sure, he handles the party's chores for them, but aside from that, he is completely useless in combat, and parties are only allowed to have 4 members. So if they want their party to become stronger, they need to replace Kurt with a powerful mage or at least someone who can handle themselves in a fight. Kurt pleads with them to let him stay in the party, but Galnova kicks him in the stomach because he is sick of listening to Kurt's whining. They don't need him anymore, and that's final. The next day, Kurt leaves the village on his own, with nowhere to go and a wallet emptier than the abyss. Kurt eventually arrives in the city of Samila, and he is down to his last few pennies, so he really needs to find a new job soon. He finds a temp work agency and decides to give it a shot. He walks in and is greeted by the receptionist. She asks him if he is here to hire someone or to look for a job, and after Kurt tells her he's here looking for work, she informs him that she will need to conduct an interview and aptitude test. First, she asks for basic details like his name, age, and hometown. So, he tells her his name is Kurt Rockhans, he's 15 years old, and he is from Hass village in the Sheen Mountains. Kirschel had no idea that there was a village up in those mountains, but moving on, she asks him what his work history was like. Kurt tells her that he was a part of Flaming Dragon Fang, but all he ever did for them was basic chores, and he was recently fired. Kirschel is surprised to hear that Kurt was part of the S-rank party, and even if he didn't do much for them, having the party's name on his application will definitely help him find a new job. Kurt is glad to hear that, and now all he needs to do is complete the aptitude test so Kirschel can figure out what his strengths and weaknesses are. Aptitudes in this world are gifts granted by God, and if Kurt is lucky, he might discover a hidden talent today. Aptitudes are graded from G rank all the way up to SSS rank, and the difference between aptitude ranks is so great that someone with a G-rank sword skill would barely be able to swing a sword, while someone with an A-rank sword skill could effortlessly split a rock in half. Kurt is excited to find out if he has a talent, but unfortunately, every single combat aptitude on his sheet is rated G-rank, so he has no hope of ever taking on a combat role. Kurt immediately loses all hope, but Kirschel tells him there's still a chance that he might have a good trade skill, like alchemy or blacksmithing. Although, the technician who handles those aptitude tests is currently on vacation, so Kurt will have to come back next week to be evaluated. Kurt tells her he won't last that long because he's one loaf of bread away from being penniless, so he really needs to find a job today. Kirschel understands Kurt's situation, so she asks him to try lifting one of those sandbags over there. Kurt gives it a shot, and as he puts his hands on the bag, he gets a strange sensation, almost like the sand drained a bit of his mana. Anyway, he lifts the bag, and since he is strong enough to do that, Kirschel thinks he should be able to handle construction work. She tells him that the Margraviate of Tycone is currently recruiting workers to help repair the city walls, so Kurt should be able to get a job there if she writes a letter of recommendation for him. Kurt is grateful for her help, so he immediately heads out to meet the Margrave. The Margrave sees the letter saying that Kurt wants to work here, but he honestly doesn't think Kurt looks like he can handle construction work. But then again, he needs all the hands he can get, so he decides to give Kurt a chance. He tells him to mix up some cement and use it to repair the wall, and his pay will be determined by how much work he puts in. The Margrave will be back to check on Kurt's progress later, and he tells him that he had better get to work soon because if he hasn't used at least half a barrel of cement by the time the Margrave is back, his pay is going to be low. Kurt wants to ask a question because the Margrave never mentioned anything about pouring mana into the cement to strengthen it, but he decides to stay quiet because it's probably common knowledge. Still, he's surprised that the quota is only half a barrel of cement because that seems way too easy. So, Kurt decides to use as much cement as he can before the Margrave returns. By the time the Margrave is back, he is shocked to see that Kurt has already finished an entire section of the wall. Kurt apologizes to him because he could have done more, but he ran out of cement halfway through. The Margrave is still having a hard time believing that Kurt really repaired over a third of the huge western wall, so he asks Kurt how he managed to repair the top of the wall. Kurt explains that he just threw the cement up there and used a stick to smooth it out. Normally, the Margrave would call Kurt a liar because that sounds impossible. But Kurt clearly managed to make it work, so he has to be telling the truth. He asks Kurt how long he plans to work here, and Kurt says he just needs the job for a week. The Margrave is glad to hear that. He tells Kurt that he has done enough work for today, so he can go home now. He doesn't have enough money on him to pay Kurt for all the work he did, so he hands him a small pouch of money and promises to send him the rest through the temp agency. Kurt is amazed because even the small pouch has more money in it than he ever could have made when he was working for the hero party. Over the next few days, Kurt continues to work hard on repairing the wall, but all of a sudden, the Margrave tells him he is being fired. Kurt asks why, so the Margrave explains that the wall repairs were supposed to provide work for people in poverty, but Kurt is way too efficient. So if he keeps working here, there will be no work left for anyone else. He isn't mad at Kurt or anything, but from what he has seen, Kurt's ability is at least SS rank, if not SSS rank, so he would be better off working in the royal capital or something. He gives Kurt a lump sum payment as compensation for being fired so suddenly and walks off, but Kurt completely misunderstands the situation and thinks the Margrave just wanted to get rid of him for being a terrible worker. He heads back to the temp agency and meets with Kirschel to tell her he got fired and it's still going to take a few days before Kurt can have his trade attributes appraised. Just then, they hear a commotion over at the front desk, and it looks like a girl is trying to set up a recruitment ad. But the receptionist at the desk tells her that no one would agree to work under such terrible conditions with what she's offering. Even so, the girl keeps insisting that the receptionist should try to find someone, and she's starting to cause a disturbance, so Kirschel goes over to see what the problem is. Kirschel's coworker tells her that this girl wants to recruit a miner to excavate a mountain that hasn't been explored, but she is refusing to offer an upfront payment, and insists on paying only if the excavation is successful. Kirschel agrees that no one in their right mind would ever agree to those terms, so she tries to convince the girl to hire investors to develop the mine. But the girl says she can't do that because if she doesn't pay the taxes by the end of the week, they'll impound her mine. Just then, Kurt walks up and says he is crazy enough to take a job like that. After all, back in his village he used to help with the mine excavation, so he has a decent amount of experience. Kirschel asks Kurt if he is sure he wants to accept, because with the contract the girl is offering, it is entirely possible that he won't get paid at all. Before Kurt can respond, the girl cuts him off and says she was actually hoping to hire a brownie dwarf, not a helpless-looking boy, so she would feel bad making Kurt do it. However, any dwarf would require an upfront payment of at least 10 silver, and the girl doesn't have that much money to spare, so she decides to take Kurt after all. As Kurt and the girl leave, Kirschel feels bad for letting him take that job because it probably isn't worth the time. Honestly, she thinks Kurt would be better off working in a brothel because she would pay a lot of money to spend the night with him. While she's daydreaming about Kurt, her coworker gets her attention and tells her that a bank transfer just came through. Apparently, it's the remaining money the Margrave promised to send to compensate for all the work Kurt did on the wall. Kirschel was expecting it to be something like 50 silver, but it's actually a check for 200 gold, and that's a lot of money. She is so shocked Kurt was actually able to make that much money that she accidentally stumbles over the sandbags on the floor. Her coworker comes over and tells her to be careful with those because they aren't regular sandbags. They are actually used to measure the amount of mana a person possesses, and they are supposed to get heavier when someone with a large mana reserve touches them. They usually don't react with regular people, so Kirschel is able to pick it up fairly easily, but she remembers seeing Kurt struggle a lot when he picked it up a few days ago, so she's starting to wonder if he really is just a normal kid. Meanwhile, Kurt and Ulysses are walking into the forest to get to her campsite, but when they get there, Kurt is a little concerned because there's only one tent. Ulysses says the tent is big enough for the two of them to sleep together, but Kurt says he'd never be able to go to sleep if he's lying next to a cute girl like her. After hearing Kurt call her cute, Ulysses gets upset because she thinks he's just trying to flatter her, but Kurt says he really does think that Ulysses is cute. Ulysses realizes Kurt genuinely meant it, so she lets go and hands him a potato for dinner. It's just a basic boiled potato, but it has been so long since anyone has cooked for Kurt, so he really appreciates it. He is also grateful for the fact that Ulysses is sitting with him to eat because Galnova and the others from the hero party always refuse to let Kurt eat in the same room as them. Later that night, Kurt and Ulysses go to bed, but Kurt is having a hard time sleeping because Ulysses went to bed in her underwear. He will never be able to go to sleep with stiff wood, so he decides to leave the tent for the night and sleep outside. Once Kurt leaves the tent, Ulysses opens her eyes because she was just pretending to fall asleep. She intentionally went to bed in her underwear to see if Kurt was the kind of person to assault her in her sleep, but now, she knows he's a good guy. The next morning, Ulysses wakes up and leaves the tent. She finds Kurt sleeping over by a tree, and she feels a little bad about making him sleep out here, but then she notices that her jacket is fixed. Kurt soon wakes up, so she asks him if he's the one who repaired her jacket, and he confirms it. She's impressed that he has so much talent for sewing, and she's starting to wonder if he is really going to be good at mining, but it's too late to find someone else, so they'd better get to work. Kurt asks Ulysses if she has decided on a location to begin mining yet, but she was just going to dig in random locations and pray to find some valuable ores. Kurt tells her she'll never find anything if she searches like that, and he happens to know a much more efficient way. He takes Ulysses to a section of the mountain, and after looking around for a bit, he finds a rock full of gemstones. Ulysses is shocked that he found it so easily, but in a matter of minutes, Kurt has located every single gemstone in this section of the mountain. Ulysses can hardly believe it because if she sells all of these gems, she'll be able to pay off her debt, but Kurt tells her she can't sell them. Ulysses realizes he's right, since Kurt was the one who found all of them, so he gets to keep the money. That's not what he meant. He was just trying to tell her that the gems will be more valuable if he turns them into magic crystals first. Kurt was right about that, but Ulysses says there are only 10 mages in the entire kingdom who are skilled enough to turn gems into magic crystals. But while she was saying all that, Kurt just finished turning a gem into a magic crystal. Ulysses is too stunned to speak because not only did Kurt create a magic crystal, but he did it instantly, when even the most experienced mages spend at least an hour to make a single magic crystal. After Kurt finishes turning all the gems into crystals, he agrees to let Ulysses go sell them, so she heads out while he stays behind on the mountain because he has a few things he wants to finish doing first. Ulysses heads to the city's customs agency and tells them that she wants to sell some magic crystals in the royal capital, but magic crystals are incredibly valuable, so the agent asks her where she got these. There's no way he would believe her if she told him that some random boy created them, so she flashes her royal family emblem to get him to stop asking questions. This is kind of a bluff since she stopped working for the royal family a while ago and they just forgot to take her emblem away, but it does the trick, so the customs agent allows her to use the teleportation circle to go to the capital. Once she's there, she heads to the shop of an old friend, and she tells Mimiko that she has some magic gems to sell. Mimiko takes a look at them, and at first, they don't seem like they'd be worth much, but upon closer inspection, she discovers that they have 10 times the normal amount of mana imbued in them, so these crystals are worth 10 gold each. Ulysses is at a loss for words because Kurt gave her 50 of these, so Mimiko casually hands her a bag of 500 gold coins. But before Ulysses leaves, Mimiko has 2 requests to make. First, she wants Ulysses to promise to only sell crystals like these at this shop because it would be a disaster if crystals that are this powerful were allowed to circulate without regulation, and secondly, she wants to know the name of the person who created the crystals. Ulysses agrees to the first condition, but she says she can't tell Mimiko the name of the crystal's creator because she'd have to ask him for permission first. Mimiko is a court mage for the royal family, so she tries using her position to order Ulysses to give up the mysterious mage's information, but Ulysses doesn't work for the royal family anymore, so she isn't obligated to obey Mimiko. Mimiko realizes she isn't going to be able to convince Ulysses to give up Kurt's information, so at least asks her to make sure he doesn't wander off to another nation. She also wants Ulysses to tell him that if he agrees to come work for the royal family, Mimiko is prepared to grant him the title of Count and full access to the Royal Research Lab and all its benefits. Ulysses then leaves Mimiko's shop, and the next morning, she returns to the mountain to meet up with Kurt, but she is shocked to find that Kurt built a whole house in the time she was gone. Setting that aside, Ulysses explains that a friend of hers wants to hire Kurt as a royal mage. If he accepts the position, he will be treated as a noble, so he'd be guaranteed a good salary with benefits no matter what. Kurt finds it hard to believe that he is really being offered such an impressive job, but Ulysses assures him that it is a genuine offer. She asks him what he wants to do, but Kurt says he's going to decline. Ulysses can't believe that Kurt would turn it down because anyone would jump at the chance to become a royal mage, and I'm just as shocked because Kurt's reason for turning it down is stupid. He thinks he doesn't deserve to be in a position that puts him above other people and he is still hoping to go back to being the Flaming Dragon's chore boy, even if he has to beg them to let him rejoin. Speaking of Flaming Dragon, they are getting their asses beaten by a tree monster. Galnova can't use his fire magic for some reason, so he asks Malphus to heal him. She has been trying to do that for a while now, but her healing magic isn't working like it usually does. Galnova asks the new guy to cast fire magic to take down the tree, but the new guy doesn't know how to use fire magic, and that's supposed to be Galnova's job anyway. The party's chemistry is completely gone without Kurt here to hold them together, and Bandana is the only one who can tell that the party is crumbling. Back to Kurt, his current job is still to help Ulysses mine gems here, and he tells her he found a good gem vein yesterday so he can get a lot more for her. Ulysses is grateful for his enthusiasm, but she is concerned that Kurt might be tired from all that he did yesterday. However, he tells her not to worry because he got 6 hours of sleep last night. Ulysses is shocked to hear that and starts doing some mental math to figure out how Kurt could have built an entire house and still manage to get 6 hours of sleep. But Kurt interprets this as Ulysses being mad that he slept too much, so he apologizes and says he will make up for his laziness. Ulysses really needs to explain Kurt's strength to him at some point, but she has no idea how to address it, so she and Kurt just head out to do more mining. Kurt leads Ulysses over to the spot he found, and although it looks like an ordinary forest section, Kurt tells her she should be able to find some good gems out here. Although, he warns her not to dig past 500 meters, as if that's something you can do accidentally. He then starts walking away, so Ulysses asks where he is going and Kurt explains that he is on his way to a different mining spot, and he will meet back up with her later. Ulysses spends all day digging and by evening time she has finally found a huge topaz gem. She deposited all the coins from the magic gems into Kurt's account because he was the one who found them. But since she found this one herself, she can use the profits to cover her taxes. She could probably even convince Kurt to turn this thing into a magic gem so she can get even more money. But she decides not to do that because she doesn't want to take advantage of Kurt's kindness. Speaking of Kurt, she decides to go see how he is doing, and from what she has seen him do so far, she knew he would go overboard. But she wasn't expecting him to have built an entire tunnel system within 8 hours. Kurt eventually comes out and he tells Yulicia that unfortunately he was only able to find a little bit of the gems that he was looking for. All the other stuff he found was just a bunch of useless rocks, and he plans on throwing them away once he is done here. Yulicia takes a look in the rock cart, and those rocks look a little too pretty to be worthless, so she asks him what they are. Kurt explains that those are mithril ores, but back in Kurt's village mithril was so common in the mines that they usually just threw it away whenever they found some. Yulicia has no words for what she just heard, and aside from wanting to know what kind of village Kurt came from, she asks him what gem he was looking for if he considers mithril as trash. Kurt pulls out a small rock and tells her he has been looking for orichalcum, but he only managed to find enough to fill a small box. Orichalcum is known as the metal of the gods, so even a gram of the stuff is worth millions, and Kurt just casually found a box of the stuff. Yulicia had no idea orichalcum could even be found in places like this. But Kurt tells her you can mine it anywhere, you just need to dig 8 kilometers into the ground to get to it. Yulicia decides that's enough mining for today, and since the topaz she found will cover her taxes, her contract with Kurt is over. That means Kurt has to start looking for another job because no one has told him about the mountain of gold in his bank account yet. While he's on his way to the agency, Kurt runs into Bandana and he's glad to see her, but he asks what she's doing here. Bandana tells him she isn't a part of Flaming Dragon anymore, but there's a little more to the story than that. After their disastrous mission, Galnova went to a 5-star restaurant to get some good food, but compared to Kurt's cooking, all the food here tastes like garbage. Galnova is enraged, so he smashes the place up and storms out without paying. As he walks into an alleyway, he meets Bandana and she tells him he went too far by destroying that restaurant. However, all Galnova cares about is getting good food, so he orders Bandana to go find Kurt and force him to come back, even if it means breaking his bones to do it. Galnova is clearly losing his mind here, so Bandana doesn't argue with him about it. She just snatched Galnova's teleportation crystal and runs out of the alley. As she leaves, she sees the city guards closing in on Galnova's location, and without his teleportation crystal, he is definitely going to be arrested for what he did at the restaurant. Additionally, Malphus was called away by the church, so the Flaming Dragon party is officially done for. Although she leaves out most of the details about Galnova going off the deep end. Kurt is disappointed to hear that Flaming Dragon has disbanded because that means he can't rejoin anymore, but Bandana doesn't understand why he would even want to go back in the first place. Kurt explains that he owes Galnova a lot, and he is still blissfully unaware of how much of a jerk Galnova was, so he is really sad that you won't be able to work with him anymore. Bandana, on the other hand, never really cared about Galnova since he was just a cover story so she could keep an eye on Kurt. Anyway, since Kurt was on his way to the agency, Bandana thinks it's safe to assume that he is looking for a job, and if that's the case, then she has the perfect thing for him. A friend of hers has been looking for someone to help in her workshop lately, and it should be a decent gig since this friend is an Atelier Master. There are only a few Atelier Masters in the world, and they are all incredibly important, so their influence is on par with that of a Viscount. Bandana asks Kurt if he wants to accept the job, and he says he'd love to, so she hands him a map and sends him on his way. Eventually, Kurt makes it to the workshop of the Atelier Master, but he is a little confused since this place looks like a regular house to him. He knocks on the door, and a little elf girl answers. At first, Kurt is a little shocked because he didn't expect the Atelier Master to be such a little girl, but Michelle explains that she is actually the Master's assistant. In that case, Kurt tells her he is here for a job, and Michelle is delighted to hear that because she needs all the help she can get. She leads Kurt into the kitchen, and as soon as he sets foot in there, he smells the stench of Davy Jones' locker. Michelle apologizes for how messy this place is, but the Master has been working her non-stop, so she hasn't had a chance to really clean up yet. Just then, the Master calls for Michelle, so she runs off and asks Kurt to help her clean up the kitchen. Kurt is a little disappointed since he thought he would get to assist the Atelier Master, but chores are simple enough for him to do, so he gets to work. 30 minutes later, Kurt has cleaned the entire kitchen, and Michelle didn't really tell him what he is supposed to do next, so he starts wandering the halls looking for her. He finds a door in one of the corridors, so he knocks on it, and a girl inside tells him to come in. However, when Kurt enters, he sees the girl practically naked on her bed. He gets flustered, and apologizes for the intrusion. But she doesn't seem bothered by Kurt seeing her like this. Kurt explains that he is looking for Michelle, so the girl tells him that Michelle is down in the basement. Kurt is about to leave to find Michelle, but then he notices a dark mark on the girl's belly. He recognizes it as a curse, so he asks the girl if he can take a close look at it. She gives him permission, so Kurt goes up to her and starts feeling the cursed spot. Curses like this usually destroy the internal organs around the afflicted area, so it must be incredibly difficult for the girl to eat. But it turns out that her stomach is still intact, so Kurt offers to go make her some food. Meanwhile, Ulysses meets with Mimiko to discuss the mithril and orichalcum that Kurt found. Kurt didn't even turn them into magic crystals this time, and the value is still over 50,000 gold coins, so Ulysses is starting to get concerned. She asks Mimiko what she thinks will happen if people find out about Kurt's skill, and in the best case scenario, Kurt will be kidnapped and forced into slavery. Worst case, she gets assassinated for being too much of a threat. Mimiko asks Ulysses what she plans to do with Kurt, and so far, Ulysses has been thinking of setting him up to become an Atelier master. That way, you would have enough power that no one would be able to take advantage of him. And then she plans to work as his bodyguard, but getting Kurt to agree to all that is going to be difficult. He is too dense to realize how skilled he truly is, and worse yet, he undervalues himself constantly. So Ulysses needs to do something before Kurt gets himself in trouble. Meanwhile, Kurt has just finished cooking some porridge for the girl he met earlier, when all of a sudden, Michelle and the Atelier master Ophelia come out of the basement. They are both surprised to see that the kitchen isn't a biohazard anymore, and even more so that Kurt cleaned it up in such a short time. Ophelia notices that Kurt is cooking some porridge, so Kurt explains that the girl he met in one of the rooms said she was hungry. Ophelia seems a bit concerned that Kurt met that girl, so she makes him promise not to tell anyone about her. Kurt promises, so Ophelia tells him he can go home for the day and hands him 3 silver coins. Kurt is surprised that she is paying him so much for just cleaning the kitchen, but she says he deserves it for working so hard and asks him to come back tomorrow. A little while later, Ophelia heads to the girl's room with the porridge Kurt made for her, and she reminds her that she's not supposed to let other people see her. That aside, Kurt doesn't seem like a threat, so Ophelia doesn't think she'll have to worry about him leaking this secret. Lieselot still hasn't eaten yet, so Ophelia asks her to wait a minute while she tests the porridge for poison. However, Lieselot says there's no need for that. She only spoke to Kurt for a little while, but her intuition tells her that he's a good person. And besides, there would be no point in trying to poison her when the curse has already progressed this far. She has had to live her life suspecting everyone around her, so just this once, she wants to trust someone fully. Ophelia understands, so she lets her eat the porridge, but after Lieselot takes her first bite, she begins sweating profusely and falls over on the floor. Ophelia thinks Kurt must have really poisoned the food after all, so she's about to go on a manhunt to kill him, but all of a sudden, Lieselot gets back up and says she is fine. In fact, she feels better than ever because the curse has been broken. Ophelia has no idea how to process what just happened because a curse like that isn't easy to break. Yet, it was undoubtedly broken by the food Kurt cooked. At that same moment, the secret organization that placed the curse on Lieselot is having a meeting because they just found out that the curse was broken. They were hoping to use it to kill Lace from a safe distance, but now they are going to have to use more drastic measures. Later that evening, Ophelia and Lieselot head into Mimiko's shop because they have something urgent to discuss. Lieselot takes off her hood, and as soon as Mimiko and Ulysses see her face, they recognize her as the third princess of the nation. Ophelia explains that a powerful curse was placed on Lieselot in an attempt to assassinate her. They aren't sure who was behind it, but Lieselot is the only child between the king and Princess Françoise from the Gurumukha kingdom, so her existence is kind of like a symbol of peace between the two nations. And Samila is clearly trying to start a war. Mimiko is glad Lieselot is alright, but she is surprised that she managed to break such a powerful curse on her own. However, Lieselot tells her she didn't do it by herself. The curse was actually broken by a man named Kurt, and as soon as the two hear Kurt's name, they freak out. They then sit down, and Ulysses still can't wrap her head around the fact that a damn bowl of porridge broke the curse Lieselot had been suffering under for years. At this point, she's well aware Kurt can pull off some wild stuff, but seriously she leaves him alone for half a day, and he ends up curing the princess. They're definitely going to reward him for it eventually, but Mimiko thinks the more urgent priority is figuring out who was behind the curse in the first place. Normally Lieselot's room is protected by anti-curse enchantments, which means someone must have tampered with them before the curse hit, and only 3 people had access to that room during the window of time it could have happened. First there's Sanover Ristkatz, the first general of the Royal Expeditionary Forces, then Tristan Maynolf, the bishop of the Poland Church, and finally Isadora, the kingdom's third queen. Obviously, they can't just start throwing accusations around without something solid to back it up. Ophelia proposes setting a trap to draw the culprit out, and she already has a pretty slick plan in mind. Since Lieselot just turned 15, royal tradition says she needs to head out for a year of training. The people who tried to kill her are bound to take another shot, so Ophelia wants to announce that Lieselot is going to be an apprentice under an Atelier Meister. The idea is to create a fake master in a fake location, then sit back and wait. Whoever is behind the curse will likely try to dig up intel to plan their next move, and when they do, they'll walk right into the trap. But for the plan to work, that means someone with real achievements to sell the lie, and Ulysses knows just the guide, so she hands Ophelia one of the magic crystals that Kurt made, and the second Ophelia lays eyes on it, she's floored. The craftsmanship and energy quality are on a whole other level. It's hands down the most flawless crystals she's ever seen. As for Kurt, the next day he heads back to Ophelia's house, ready to get back to work. But when he gets there, there's a note on the door saying she's out. He then runs into Michelle and asks what's going on, and she explains that after he left the day before, Ophelia suddenly went out with Lieselot and hasn't returned since. That means there's nothing lined up for Kurt today, so he ends up walking off a little bummed and decides to swing by the guild and grab something to eat. While Kurt is eating, he overhears a party chatting at the table next to him. They're clearly in a panic because their porter came down sick, and without one, they won't be able to handle their next quest. They don't have time to advertise for a replacement either, so it looks like they're going to have to pull the plug on the mission altogether. Kurt thinks it over and figures he can handle a porter's duties just fine. So, he gets up, heads over to their table, and politely introduces himself. He admits he's pretty useless in a fight, but he's confident that he can still hold his weight as their porter. Sina laughs at the idea, saying a twig like him wouldn't survive the first haul. Kenz immediately smacks her upside the head and apologizes for his sister's rude attitude. But he still isn't convinced because the porters deal with some serious heavy lifting and their current mission involves hauling golems that weigh over 200 kilos each. But Kurt casually responds that 200 kilos is no problem, and just to prove it, he casually picks up both Kenz and Danzo at the same time. And he makes it look like he's carrying pillows, even with Kenz decked out in 150 kilos of armor, so that's more than enough to convince them, and they officially bring him on board as their substitute porter. As they head toward the mission site, the crew gives Kurt a proper introduction. Kenz is the squad's frontline brawler, and he's got a sword but prefers his fists. Danzo is a samurai, and Sina handles the long-range game as a ranger. There's supposed to be one more member, but he's homesick, which is why they needed Kurt to fill in. They tell them they're happy to have him on board, and Kurt thanks them for giving a talentless guy like him a chance. That catches them off guard, since nobody who can casually squat 400 kilos should be calling themselves weak, but they figure he's just being modest, or maybe has a weird sense of humor. The group keeps moving forward, but then Kurt suddenly lets out a scream. The whole party whips around to help, thinking something serious has happened, only to find Kurt frantically wrestling with a slime. He's absolutely freaking out, and Sina has to step in to tell him to relax because all he needs to do is strike the slime's core to kill it. Kurt tries to follow Sina's instructions, but the second he goes to stab the slime's core, his knife just bounces off. It refuses to pierce, and somehow, he ends up poking himself instead. It's clear he's completely hopeless in combat, so Sina steps in and slices the slime cleanly in half. She's shocked by just how awful his attack form really is. Sure, he mentioned earlier that he sucked at fighting, but she didn't think he was this bad. Kurt apologizes, clearly embarrassed, but the team doesn't even blink. They tell him not to stress over it because his job is just to lighten the team's load during quests, and he doesn't need to fight because that's what they're here for. Kurt is stunned because he just failed miserably, but no one's mad at him, and they're actually being nice. This is a whole different vibe from how he was treated in Flaming Dragon Fang, so honestly, he's just grateful he ended up with a team this good. A little while later, they finally reach the cave, but it's pitch black inside. Sina spreads some glow moss to light the place up, and with better visibility, Kurt notices something odd. There's a piece of shit on a nearby rock. He nervously asks if that's something he should be worried about. Sina takes one glance and tells him it's goblin droppings. Judging by how fresh it is, there's a good chance a goblin nest is nearby. Kurt immediately starts to panic because if he couldn't even deal with the slime, how the hell is he supposed to do against goblins? But Kenz reassures him, as long as it's just a few that got it handled. That said, if they run into an entire goblin horde, it's game over, so they just need to be careful and avoid making too much noise. They move deeper into the cave, and eventually, they find a set of ancient-looking ruins. As they're walking, Kurt notices something weird about one of the walls. Something doesn't feel right. But before he can figure it out, Sina spots a goblin nearby and immediately tries to take it down. Unfortunately, she's a second too late. The goblin managed to shout before she could land the hit. And now they can all hear it, the unmistakable sound of dozens of goblin feet storming toward them from both ends of the tunnel. This wasn't supposed to happen because the report said nothing about a horde. Now they are outnumbered and trapped, and even with no exit in sight, so Sina turns to Danzo, hoping he has some kind of plan. But looking at the numbers, the only option left is to fight and hope for a miracle. Kurt suddenly speaks up and tells the group he found the hidden passage tucked behind the wall. That's definitely a relief, but even with a secret tunnel, there's no way they'll outrun the goblins, not all of them together, so they need a distraction. Danzo and Kenz exchange a silent nod with Sina, and she immediately gets what they mean. Without saying much, she grabs Kurt and pulls him into the hidden passage, slamming the door shut behind them. Kurt starts freaking out, asking why she locked the door while Danzo and Kenz are still outside, but Sina explains that this is what they wanted. Kenz then calls out that if all four of them try to run, the goblins will just chase them down. So, he and Danzo are going to act as bait, draw the goblins away, and buy Kurt and Sina time to escape. It's a suicide mission and they all know it. Kurt is desperate to go back, but Sina stops him. She doesn't like abandoning her teammates either, but there's no other option. Kurt can't fight at all, and her own combat skills are only decent, so they just slow Danzo and Kenz down if they stayed, so this is how it has to be. Still, she's clinging to hope, saying she's sure the others will survive somehow, but deep down, Danzo and Kenz know they won't make it. Even so, they have no regrets. If they're going to die, they'd rather go out protecting their allies because that to them is the highest form of honor. Sina then tells Kurt they need to get moving, so she tosses some glow moss around the area to light the place up and look for an exit. But then her face drops. This isn't just a secret passage, it's a boss room, and they're not alone in here because an iron dragon is standing before them. Meanwhile back in town, Liselot tells Ulyssia that she wants to see Kurt again, so Ulyssia agrees to take her to his inn. When they get there, Ulyssia picks the lock like it's nothing, and the two of them slip into Kurt's room, but to their surprise, it's empty. Suddenly, a voice speaks out, telling them that if they're looking for Kurt, he's on a mission near the northeastern caves. Ulyssia jumps at the sound and runs outside to confront whoever it is, but by the time she gets there, Bandana is already gone. Confused, she processes what she just heard, but if Kurt really is in those caves, he might be in serious danger. Ulyssia remembers that not long ago there was a goblin slaying training program held in that region. If any of those goblins survive, there's a good chance they regrouped and built a nest there. Ulyssia immediately tells Liselot to stay behind because she's going after Kurt herself, but Liselot refuses and says if Kurt's in danger, she wants to help. Ulyssia tries to reason with her, pointing out that dragging a princess into a monster-infested cave isn't exactly smart, but Liselot insists. She's been practicing magic since she was little and she's confident she can handle herself. Besides, Ulyssia is her bodyguard, so leaving Liselot alone would be even more reckless. Ulyssia knows there's no winning this argument, so she reluctantly agrees. The two of them then head toward the cave entrance, and the moment they step inside, they notice faint trails of glow moss still glowing on the walls, so someone was here not long ago. Liselot casts a sensory enhancement spell and Ulyssia assumes she's going to heighten her hearing to locate Kurt, but instead Liselot drops to all fours and starts sniffing the ground like a bloodhound. She'd only spent maybe 10 minutes with Kurt, but that was apparently more than enough for her to memorize his scent. After sniffing around for a bit, she picks up his trail and right after, she catches the sound of battle echoing from down one of the tunnels. She quickly notifies Ulyssia and buffs her stats, so she can rush in to help. Elsewhere in the cave, Danzo and Kans are still fighting tooth and nail to hold off the goblin swarm. Their stamina is running out and their movements are getting slower, but before the goblins can land a killing blow, a blur flashes through the horde. In the blink of an eye, Ulyssia cuts them all down in a single strike. Over in a sealed chamber, Sina is already on her knees fully convinced that this is the end for them. There's just no way to take down a full-blown iron dragon golem, not with what they've got. So, she turns to Kurt and apologizes for getting him into this whole mess. But Kurt tells her not to stress because he's dealt with these kinds of things plenty of times. Sina blinks in disbelief as Kurt calmly walks toward the hulking monster. Right as the beast swings at him, Kurt leaps up and lands square on its tail. He gives it a gentle poke with his dagger, and just like that, the entire tail gets sliced clean off. He follows up by doing the same to all of the dragon's limbs, one light taps at a time until the creature collapses in pieces. Sina just stares in shock. How the hell did the guy who couldn't even kill a slime take down a dragon golem like it was nothing? Honestly, she's kind of terrified right now, but Kurt doesn't get what the big deal is, because to him, mining golems is just another day at work. Just then, Ulyssia bursts into the secret chamber, eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. Instead, she finds Kurt casually standing in front of a pile of dragon golem parts like it's no big deal. Kurt lights up when he sees her and immediately asks if she can help Danzo and Kens because they might still be in danger. But Ulyssia quickly reassures him that she already took care of it and they're a little banged up, but they'll live. Now that everyone's safe, the whole group gathers up inside the room to talk things over. First, Danzo and Kens thank Ulyssia for saving their lives, saying that if she hadn't shown up when she did, they'd be goblin chow. But Ulyssia brushes it off and says they don't need to thank her. Instead, she turns to Kurt and says there's something important she wants to ask him. As Kurt loads up a few dragon parts to carry, Ulyssia tells him that she's opening a brand new atelier and wants him on board. Kurt hesitates because he's still part of this party and it doesn't feel right to bail on them, but Kans waves him off immediately, saying it's a great opportunity and he shouldn't let it pass him by. If Ulyssia's offering, then Kurt should absolutely take it. With her blessing, Kurt agrees to join the atelier. Ulyssia also mentions that she needs some muscle to guard the shop once it opens and asks Kans and the others if they're up for the job. The answer's an enthusiastic yes, and Kans even says this calls for a proper celebration once they're back in town. Speaking of town, Ulyssia reminds Kurt to stop by the guild agency and get his skills officially evaluated because she's already arranged for someone to handle the appraisal personally. A few hours later, Kurt arrives at the agency and is introduced to Mimiko, a high-ranking mage of the royal court. She's heard rumors about Kurt's talents and offers to perform an aptitude check for his non-combat skills. When it's done, Mimiko tells him all his stats came out as B rank, but that's a total lie because in reality every single reading came back as triple S rank, and his mana pool is bigger than anything Mimiko has ever seen. So she's relieved it was her who handled the appraisal because if this information got out, it could lead to a kingdom-wide crisis. Honestly, the only option would be to silence any witnesses immediately, which is a real problem, considering Kirschel just overheard the whole thing. The next morning, the group sets off straight to the town where the new Atelier workshop was supposed to be established. However, Ulysses still hadn't mentioned who the new Atelier master would be, so Kenz was particularly eager to meet this mysterious figure. Ulysses, of course, can't just drop the truth, so she starts throwing together excuses on the fly. At this point, Sina's already figured out that Ulysses didn't bring their party along out of the kindness of her heart, and when Kenz asked about the master, Ulysses got all weird, which only made Sina more suspicious. As they approached the town, Kurt suddenly realized it was the same place where he had repaired the wall, given his misunderstanding that the Margrave had dismissed him for poor work, returning here filled with anxiety. Eventually, Ulysses led the group directly to the site intended for the Atelier workshop, but calling it a workshop felt ridiculous. The area was nothing more than an empty plot of land. Kenz boldly pointed out that they couldn't exactly run a shop from an empty patch of dirt, and Ulysses quickly reassured him she was aware of that. Instead, she explained the group would wait at an inn until Kurt finished building the Atelier workshop himself. Turning to Kurt, she asked if he thought he could finish it by the end of the day. Kurt, however, felt this was far too unreasonable. Even with his skills, a single day just wasn't enough, but he estimated he'd probably need at least 3 days. Understanding his position, Ulysses immediately told Kurt to take all the time he needed, emphasizing that there was no rush. She also let him know that if he required additional materials, she was ready to provide anything he requested. Relieved to hear this, Kurt promptly produced a list of materials he had already prepared in his mind. Ulysses took the paper and glanced over the items, things like amethyst and griffin feathers, which immediately caught Sina's attention. She couldn't understand why such rare materials were necessary just to build a simple workshop. Ulysses, however, had learned by now not to question Kurt's methods. She simply assured him that she'd do her best to obtain everything he asked for. Unfortunately, collecting these materials would take a couple of days, but Kurt was totally okay with waiting. Sina still had this weird gut feeling that something fishy is going on, and Ulysses can tell she's on to her, but still neither of them says anything and just plays it cool for now. Finally, Ulysses instructed everyone to head over to the inn, allowing Kurt to work undisturbed. However, before leaving him to his task, she gently reminded Kurt to take care of himself, making him promise that he'd return to the inn by nightfall to rest and eat properly. Meanwhile, once everyone arrived at the inn, Ulysses gathered them together, explaining that she had something important to share. Until now, Kenz and Danzo assumed Kurt was just an ordinary person, but Ulysses knew she couldn't hide the truth indefinitely, especially since Sina had already witnessed Kurt's extraordinary abilities. Sina then immediately asked Ulysses to tell them exactly who Kurt really was, but Ulysses hesitated, wanting to formally introduce herself first. She took out her royal family crest, revealing to them that she was actually an adventurer in service of the royal family. Then gesturing to the girls seated across from them, Ulysses introduced Liselotte as the third princess of the kingdom. Kenz, Danzo, and Sina were all stunned by this revelation. Kenz awkwardly stood up unsure if he should greet Liselotte properly, but the princess reassured him that formalities weren't necessary. Since she was currently keeping her identity hidden, Liselotte gently asked them to treat her as they would any ordinary girl. Considering Liselotte's royal status, Sina quickly asked if that means Kurt is a noble too, but Ulysses clarified that Kurt wasn't royal or noble, he was just a regular civilian. Well, maybe not exactly normal, but certainly not noble. Ulysses confessed that even she didn't fully understand Kurt's background. However, she did know that all of his combat skills were officially rank G, while literally every other skill he possessed was rated at an unbelievable triple S rank. Kenz, Danzo, and Sina were speechless, finding it hard to believe such legendary skill levels could even exist, though it made perfect sense after witnessing Kurt in action. Ulysses continued, emphasizing that Kurt's true abilities were classified information and none of them were permitted to discuss it with anyone. Even Kurt himself wasn't aware of the truth. Ulysses and Mimiko had lied to him, telling him he was only at B rank. Moreover, Ulysses revealed that Kurt was actually intended to become the new Atelier master, although she had no plans of telling him the real reason behind this. Hearing this, Sina suddenly stood up, angrily confronting Ulysses about her deception. She couldn't understand why Ulysses would lie to Kurt like that, especially about something so important. Ulysses tried to justify herself by suggesting that Kurt wouldn't believe the truth even if she told him. Sina wasn't buying that explanation and angrily called Ulysses out, saying that it was a ridiculous excuse. Ulysses then attempted another justification, claiming she was merely trying to protect Kurt, because if his true abilities became public knowledge, others would surely exploit him. But Sina countered sharply, stating that from her point of view, Ulysses was the one doing the exploiting. On a loser's bond to Sina's accusations, Ulysses fell silent. Sina, thoroughly disgusted by the situation, turned to Kenz and made it clear that she wanted nothing more to do with this entire mess. After his short silence, Danzo asked Liselotte to explain a bit more about their situation. Liselotte nodded and told them that just a few days ago, Kurt had broken a deadly curse placed on her, and he'd done it simply by giving her a bowl of porridge. Currently, someone was after Liselotte's life, which was why they devised this whole scheme about setting up an Atelier master. Their plan was to draw the assassins out, identify the culprit, and finally put an end to it. Of course, Kurt wasn't aware of any of this yet. Liselotte understood that it seemed selfish dragging Kurt into their plan without telling him, but she assured them that she and Yulia deeply cared about Kurt, and would never intentionally put him in harm's way. She asked them earnestly if they'd be willing to keep this secret and join forces with them to ensure Kurt's safety. Danzo took a moment before responding, clarifying that as adventurers, they weren't obligated to follow the orders of any royalty, but since Kurt was their friend, they'd do anything necessary to protect him. Cans quickly echoed Danzo's sentiment, reassuring Lieselot they were fully on board. Lieselot was relieved to hear they would help, but Sina still thought this was too much considering they'd known Kurt for barely 2 days. Yulia understood exactly how Sina felt after all. Even though Yulia talked about Kurt as if they were old friends, she'd only met him last week herself. To this day, she still found it hard to believe the incredible things she'd seen Kurt do. Sina excused herself, saying she needed to take a walk to clear her head before making any decisions. As she wandered through town, Sina found herself heading toward Kurt's worksite. She felt strongly that Kurt deserved to know the truth about his strength, but as she approached, she froze, completely shocked by what she saw. In just a few short hours since they left, Kurt had already laid down the entire foundation for the workshop by himself. She approached Kurt asking if he really built all of this alone. Kurt casually confirmed that he had, adding that he thought this was pretty normal since Yulia had told him he was only B rank. Sina stared at him in disbelief because there was absolutely no way any B rank could have pulled off something like this so quickly. It dawned on her that Kurt's perception of ranks was completely warped, especially since he'd grown up in a village where building a dozen houses in a single day was considered normal. By his own standards, Kurt actually felt he was going a bit too slow. Still, Sina couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't right for Yulia to keep Kurt in the dark and have him do all this work. She asked him if he felt resentful at all, considering the heavy load that had suddenly been placed on his shoulders. Kurt just smiled softly and shook his head. He explained to her that he had no reason to be upset because he actually enjoyed being useful. Back when he was part of the hero party, they constantly belittled him, calling him useless, and eventually kicking him out entirely. But here, everyone recognized his worth, and that alone made Kurt happier than he could express. Meanwhile, Danzo is hanging around the town square for a meeting with a trusted informant, one who just so happens to look a lot like Bandana. Remember how Danzo's party hired Kurt after their original porter got sick? Well, turns out that wasn't just bad luck. The so-called porter Bibanak was actually a spy planted in their group with the goal of tearing them apart from the inside. Apparently, some jealous adventurers who couldn't stand how successful Danzo's team was had paid him off to sabotage them. The informant already tracked Bibanak down and left clear directions for where to find him, so now Danzo can do whatever he wants with that info. He pays her for the solid intel, and later that day, he heads out to a local tavern. Sitting at one of the tables is a bald scumbag who's sulking into his drink. Not only did the waitress give him a dirty look when he tried to grope her, but his whole plot to wipe out Danzo's crew also flopped hard. Still, he's already cooking up a new scheme. He recently caught wind that Danzo's party is now working with an Atelier workshop that has ties to the third princess. If he plays his cards right, targeting them now could score him a fat payday. That's when Danzo speaks up from the shadows and asks if he's enjoying what might be his last drink. Bibanak hears that voice, freezes, then bolts for the door. He takes off down the alley in full panic mode, but he doesn't get far because he trips right over a perfectly placed wire and crashes to the ground hard. Danzo strolls toward him without rushing. At first, he brushed off Bibanak's sketchy excuse when he called in sick for that mining job, but now it's crystal clear that the whole thing was part of a setup. Bibanak tries to fake innocence, acting like he doesn't know what the hell Danzo's talking about, but it's way too late for that damn crap. Danzo draws his sword and takes a swing at Bibanak's neck, but stops just short. He decides not to spill blood, at least not tonight. Instead, he leans in close and tells Bibanak to stay the hell away from him and his team because if he shows his face again, Danzo swears he won't hesitate next time. Danzo walks off and not far behind, Bandana watches from around a corner. She's clearly frustrated that Danzo didn't finish Bibanak off because odds are that guy's going to be a problem later, so she figures she'll just take care of it herself. But before she can make a move, two hooded figures suddenly show up and start hauling Bibanak away. She instantly recognizes them. They're part of the Phantom Squad, a unit that reports directly to Mimiko. Now she's really wondering why a royal court mage would be mixed up in something like this. That's when her messenger Crow shows up with a letter from her superior, telling her to back off since this whole situation falls under Marfa's authority. That's another disappointment for Bandana, but orders are orders. So, with nothing left for her to do here, she gets ready to head back to Kurt's village. But speaking of Marfa's, things aren't going too well for her either because she's been captured and is currently trapped inside a freaking magic circle. Back in town, Danzo and Kans wake up the next day and are completely blown away when they see what Kurt built. The dude even managed to add trees and shrubs, and they have no damn clue how he got them to grow overnight. Everyone's stunned except Lieselot, who's off in her own little world daydreaming about marrying Kurt and living with him here forever. Then Kurt walks out to say good morning and invites them inside. He gives them a full tour of the place, starting with the entrance, then showing off the 2 basement floors and even the custom water purification system he built using magic gems. He also made sure there were rooms for everyone, plus a special one reserved for the Atelier Master. And speaking of the Master, Kurt still has no clue that it's supposed to be him. Yulia doesn't want to drop that on him yet, so she quickly makes up a story about the Atelier master being delayed. Then she switches gears and casually asks Kurt where his room is, but Kurt, with his usual low self-esteem, says he doesn't need one. He figured he'd just crash in a broom closet since all he's really good for is running errands. Of course, everyone immediately shuts that down and insists he use the Atelier master's room instead since it's just sitting empty, but convincing him takes 2 full hours. Yulia then asks Kurt if he could set up a barrier around the house to help block out curses, but Kurt's never actually made a barrier before, so he's not even sure if that's something he can pull off. In that case, Yulia figures she'll just have to rely on the backup ward spells that Mimiko left behind, so she spends the whole night placing them around the property one by one. The final seal has to go right outside Lieselott's room, so Yulia heads over and sticks it up. But the second Lieselott hears footsteps out in the hallway, she assumes Kurt's trying to sneak into her room and she practically sprints to the door ready to greet him with open arms. But when she sees it's just Yulia, she's super let down since she was clearly hoping to rope Kurt into cuddling with her for the night. Yulia tells her to cut the weird fantasies and warns her not to mess with Kurt's innocent head, especially since he's the kind of guy who'd do anything just to feel useful. So if she told him to plow her field, he'd likely grab his innocent shovel and start digging her. The next day, Kurt's busy in the kitchen cooking breakfast for everyone when Lieselott strolls out wearing nothing but an apron. Yulia loses it and tells her to stop trying to poor guy, but Lieselott shrugs it off saying she's got clothes on underneath. Barely, but still. Once breakfast is ready, the group all sits down to eat and everyone's blown away by how good the food tastes. But Yulia notices something weird. Kurt isn't there with them. Lieselott says she heard him talking earlier about wanting to clean up some graffiti someone drew on the mansion walls. Yulia freezes because that graffiti he mentioned was definitely the set of barrier spells she placed last night. Normally, no one could just scrub off a ward with a rag, but this is Kurt we're talking about, so she rushes out in a panic to stop him, but she's already too late. He's wiped out every single spell, and he still thinks it was just some random doodle someone drew on the walls. Yulia never told him about the curse assassination attempt targeting Lieselott, so now thanks to his extreme overachieving, Lieselott's completely exposed to curses again. And with Mimiko gone, there's nobody around to throw out another set of barrier seals, so now Yulia has no idea what the hell to do next. Meanwhile, Malphus has been summoned to a meeting with the bishop of the church. The moment she arrives, he bluntly informs her that she is being excommunicated. Stunned, Malphus demands to know the reason behind this decision, so the bishop explains that numerous complaints and solid evidence have surfaced regarding the violent and destructive behavior of a flaming dragon faun party. To make matters worse, he recently received word that Golnova has been declared a wanted criminal, and the church wants to sever all ties with her before things escalate further. Malphus tries desperately to plead her case, insisting that she personally hasn't done anything wrong aside from that one incident where she casually electrocuted a minimum wage waiter with level 5 lightning magic. But in her defense, she argues the food he served was absolutely terrible, so he totally deserved it. Obviously, that kind of excuse would never hold up in court, but the bishop wasn't exactly a saint himself. Sensing an opportunity, he tells Malphus that he's willing to turn a blind eye to her minor sins and even promote her to the rank of priest, but only if she does one little favor for him. The moment she gives promotion to priest, Malphus' eyes practically light up like a kid in a candy shop, and she eagerly agrees to whatever he asks, ready to get on her knees, metaphorically or otherwise, if that's what it takes. However, the situation takes an unexpected turn. The bishop casually pours a glass of wine and offers it to her, which she drinks without question. Then, instead of anything remotely close to what she imagined, the bishop calmly tells her that he wants her to assassinate the third princess of the kingdom. Malphus would normally have refused outright, but by the time she realizes the truth, it's too late. The wine was laced with a deadly curse, ensuring a slow, agonizing death unless she complies. Cornered with no other way out, Malphus swears loyalty to the bishop's plan, which unfortunately for her, includes sealing her inside a magic circle alongside a demon to guarantee her obedience. Back at Kurt's mansion, things are a lot more peaceful. Everyone is enjoying a hearty breakfast, and surprisingly, Lieselott hasn't suffered from any new curses, despite Kurt accidentally wiping out all the old protective spells. Yulia still hasn't figured out why no new curses have been placed on Lieselott yet, but since Kurt's magic-infused cooking has powerful purification properties, it's likely neutralizing any attempts before they take hold. Either way, it looks like Lieselott's safety isn't in jeopardy anymore, especially now that Mimiko has finally arrived in town. And with Ophelia's help, they've begun weaving a sophisticated information network to sniff out anyone plotting against Lieselott. Lieselott soon notices that there's something a little different about the cake Kurt made today, and Kurt explains that he used rice flour instead of regular wheat flour. Lieselott absolutely loves the flavor because it reminds her of the rice porridge Kurt made for her back when they first met, so she excitedly asks if he would be willing to make it for her again if she ever got cursed. Kurt warmly tells her he'd be happy to whip up as much rice porridge as she wants, though he assures her that she doesn't have to worry about being cursed anymore. Yulia hearing this looks a little surprised and asks Kurt how he can be so confident, especially when he had told her earlier that he couldn't set up any anti-curse barriers. Kurt confirms that while he can't install barriers inside the mansion, it's only because the entire house itself already functions as one massive curse barrier. Any curse-based magic cast at them will automatically be reflected back at the sender, although Kurt did make a few personal adjustments to it. As fate would have it, at that exact moment, one of the assassins targeting Lieselot decides to launch a fresh curse. The magician starts the ritual for his most powerful curse yet, but instead of hitting Lieselot, the magic immediately backfires. The curse dissipates harmlessly and rebounds onto the caster, which makes his body glow forever like an electric lamp. Kurt had set up the barrier to retaliate this way specifically because he didn't want to outright kill anyone, no matter how much they might deserve it, and this seemed like a far more humane alternative. Yulichia is once again left speechless by Kurt's incredible skill. She's relieved to see that Kurt is doing so much to protect Lieselot, but she knows she needs to go inform Ophelia and Mimiko immediately so they can track down anyone who suddenly looks like they swallowed a spotlight. Since Yulichia will be tied up for a while, Kurt casually strolls over to Lieselot and asks if she'd like to go shopping with him. Lieselot is completely stunned because this is practically the same as asking her out on a date, but Kurt simply thought it might be nice to take a walk through the city, especially since Lieselot hasn't had a chance to leave the mansion yet. Overwhelmed but touched, Lieselot thanks him for the offer. However, considering the current situation, she regretfully tells him she can't go out at all. At the same time, atop the city walls, Margrave Alriad and his Vice-General Generic are surveying the horizon with growing concern. It appears that a massive horde of monsters is advancing toward the city. Still, they probably don't need to panic just yet because the walls have been fully repaired and their army stands ready to defend at a moment's notice. At the same moment, Yulichia, Mimiko, and Ophelia finally track down the human lightbulb, but unfortunately it seems his own comrades killed him. They must have realized that dragging a glowing corpse around would attract too much attention. Even so, Yulichia is surprised that Kurt's glowing curse remains active even after death. Seeing how impressive that is for a spell he whipped up on short notice, Ophelia suggests they just come clean to Kurt and ask for his help because it would make finding the assassins a lot easier. But Yulichia hesitates, saying she doesn't want to drag Kurt into this any more than she already has, even though she knows deep down that he's already way too involved. Just then, alarm bells start ringing all across the city. The monsters have begun their assault. Up on the walls, the Margrave orders his soldiers to fire off light spells to illuminate the battlefield, and when the light reveals what's coming, his heart sinks. An endless horde of skeletons is slowly advancing toward the wall, and there's no way his troops can hold the line against that many. Realizing this, he commands a portion of his forces to stay behind and fight to the death if necessary, buying time while the rest focus on evacuating as many civilians as possible. The Margrave is fully prepared to lay down his life for his people. But just as the skeletons reach the outer walls, something incredible happens. They begin vanishing one after another, dissolving into nothingness. The Margrave has no clue what the hell is going on until it hits him. This section of the wall is rebuilt by Kurt. Somehow, someway, Kurt must have put something into the walls themselves that purifies the monsters, so in the end, the entire skeleton army is wiped out without a single casualty. Meanwhile, we jump back to Malphus, still trapped within the demon's magic circle. The bishop had made a pact with this advanced class demon, fueling its summoning magic with Malphus mana. With the first wave failing miserably, the demon begins preparing even more skeletons, planning to keep draining Malphus' life force until there's nothing left of her. Back inside the city, Kurt has just gotten word of the attack and asked Yulichia if they're going to be alright. Yulichia explains that the entire city is now surrounded on all sides by monsters. While the knights are scrambling to form a counterattack, there's only so much they can do given the situation. Right now, the only reason the city hasn't fallen already is because a huge chunk of the skeletons was purified the moment they set foot near the walls. Kurt explains that he enchanted the walls during the repairs, and honestly, stuff like this was considered basic maintenance back in his village. He's genuinely surprised that people here never thought about enchanting their walls before. That said, Kurt only got the chance to reinforce 2 of the city's 4 walls, meaning if the skeletons shift their attack to the unprotected sections, they'll break through the city walls pretty fast. Lieselot then does the logical thing and politely asks Kurt if he could just whip up a weapon that could wipe out all the skeletons at once. Kurt starts seriously considering it, but before he can say anything, Yulichia abruptly cuts in, announcing that she needs to step out for a while. Before leaving, she sternly reminds both Kurt and Lieselot that they are absolutely forbidden from stepping outside the mansion under any circumstances. Lieselot is more than happy with that arrangement. After all, it means she gets to enjoy some uninterrupted time alone with Kurt. Meanwhile, Yulichia heads to the storage room and grabs a box packed full of the powerful magic crystals Kurt had previously crafted. Armed with her secret weapon, Yulichia, Ophelia, and Mimiko rush over to meet with the Margrave. Alriad immediately recognizes Yulichia since they're old acquaintances, but he's stunned to see her here of all places. Yulichia wastes no time getting to the point. She has a plan to stop the skeleton invasion. Since the monsters seem to be spawning from the nearby ruins, she proposes striking the source directly and destroying it. Of course, for that to happen, Alriad and his soldiers will need to act as a diversion, drawing the skeletons away from the ruins long enough for her team to reach it. Alriad thinks the plan is ridiculously risky and hesitates to approve it, but Yulia reassures him with full confidence, revealing one of Kurt's magic crystals. She explains that a single one of these stones carries enough destructive power to level an entire building, more than enough to obliterate the ruins and cut off the skeleton army at its roots. Seeing Ulysses' determination, Alriad ultimately agrees, but under one condition. He insists on joining the strike team himself. Ulysses knows Alriad is no slouch when it comes to combat, but still asks if he's truly prepared to put his life on the line. Alriad doesn't back down because as far as he's concerned, it's his sworn duty to protect this city. Besides, with his Vice General Generic handling the command of the main force and Mimiko and Ophelia guarding the civilians, he can afford to go personally. At the same time in the mansion, Kurt finishes sweeping the garden when he starts thinking about what Lieselot said earlier regarding making a weapon. With that in mind, he heads toward the forge he built and gets straight to work. He mentioned that back in his village, the blacksmiths could craft incredible weapons with such effortless skill. And while Kurt still struggles with his confidence, he's determined to be useful to his friends. No matter what it takes, he's going to give it everything he's got to forge a proper weapon. At the same time, Ulysses and Alriad are preparing to set out, but they find their path blocked by a horde of monsters. Thinking quickly, Ulysses pulls out one of the magic crystals Kurt made and readies it. She warns the soldiers to close their eyes, and the moment the crystal strikes the ground, a blinding flash of light completely wipes out the monsters. Ulysses had known Kurt's crystals were powerful, but she never expected them to purify such a huge number of enemies all at once. Regardless, it plays to their advantage, clearing the way for the soldiers to hold off the next wave, while Ulysses and Alriad make their way toward the ruins. Back at the mansion, Kurt has just finished forging the blade, but after carefully putting the final touches on it, old insecurities start creeping back into his mind. He was told once that his blacksmithing was only B rank, and deep down, he still doubts whether a sword he made could ever be good enough to fight real monsters. A few minutes later, Lieselot comes by looking for Kurt to ask him about dinner, but then her eyes fall on the sword he's holding and she immediately thinks it looks beautiful. Seeing her reaction, Kurt shyly offers it to her, telling her she can have it if she likes it that much. However, he warns her to be careful because he packed quite a lot of magic power into the blade. Lieselot thanks Kurt for the gift, but even though Kurt is completely oblivious when it comes to his own talents, he definitely knows what a forced smile looks like. It's obvious that something is bothering Lieselot, and truth be told, he's been noticing it for a while now, so he asks her directly if someone is targeting her. Lieselot is surprised that Kurt figured it out, but she admits he's right and apologizes for all the trouble she's caused. Kurt tells her there's no need to apologize, but Lieselot still feels awful because everyone keeps getting dragged into danger because of her. Right now, Ulysses is even out there risking her life just for Lieselot's sake. Although Kurt figured out that someone's after her, he still has no clue that Lieselot is actually a princess, or that keeping her safe is a matter of national security. All he knows is that Ulysses went off to handle something near the ruins, and he vaguely recalls how Gulnova once drew graffiti all over those same ruins. So, Kurt, connecting the dots in the wrong way, assumes that Ulysses must be battling some crazy graffiti artist who's been stalking Lieselot. His conclusion is way off the mark, but it doesn't change the fact that Ulysses is fighting for Lieselot's sake, and Kurt absolutely hates the feeling of being powerless to help her because his combat skills are trash. He can't stand sitting here doing nothing while the people he cares about are in danger, and Lieselot feels the same. She hates the idea of others putting themselves at risk just to protect her, and she would much rather fight for herself if she had the strength to do it. Since she brings it up, Kurt casually suggests that the two of them should just go out and catch the culprit themselves. Lieselot is immediately on board with the idea, but she points out one major problem. The city is completely surrounded by monsters right now, so how are they even going to get outside? Kurt, without missing a beat, tells her that's not an issue because he has his own ways of getting around problems like this. Meanwhile, all the way out on the battlefield, Ulysses suddenly shivers, sensing deep in her gut that Kurt is probably about to do something insane again. Back at the mansion, Lieselot was preparing herself for battle when she realized she hadn't yet tested the enchanted blade Kurt had given her. She was curious to see what kind of magic it held, so she raised it above her head. But to her wonder, nothing occurred. At that moment, Kurt stepped into the room to ask if Lieselot was finished getting ready, and when she turned to face him, it was clear that the magic sword had indeed activated something. At the same time, Ulysses and Alriad were still forcing their way through the horde of undead. Thanks to the squad, the number of creatures had been reduced, but plenty still remained, and Ulysses had been relying on those magic crystals for quite some time, leaving her nearly out. Just then, Alriad was struck in the abdomen by one of the monsters, so Ulysses attempted to assist him, but she was quickly overwhelmed by enemies, unable to reach for a crystal in time to defend herself. Fortunately, at the critical moment, Cans and the others arrived to rescue her. They had heard about the situation, so as soon as they completed their mission, they returned as quickly as possible. They eventually located the source where the monsters were being summoned, so Ulysses used one of the magic crystals to eliminate all the creatures in the vicinity, clearing a path through the building's entrance. Ulysses handed Alriad some of Kurt's restorative soup to help him recover from his injury, and once he was fully healed, she prepared to advance. More creatures had started emerging from the building, but Cans and the others handled them, allowing Yulia and Auriat to proceed inside without interference. At the same time, deep within the ruins, Malphus was still having her mana drained, and at this rate, she was inevitably going to perish, but the demon paid no mind. What did catch his attention, however, was that the humans were holding their ground against the monsters, performing far better than he had anticipated. He was particularly impressed by Yulia and Auriat, since they had already managed to enter the ruins, so he decided to confront them directly. As Yulia and Auriat made their way down the corridors, they eventually discovered the spawning ground for the undead, so she threw one of Kurt's magic crystals into the chamber, completely eradicating the creatures along with whatever incantation had been sustaining the summoning. Yulia was genuinely astonished that everything had gone so smoothly, but of course, things were never that easy, because moments later, the demon manifested before them, forcing them to confront it directly. Yulia rushed forward, wielding one of the magic crystals as a weapon against the demon. However, while the crystal's power clearly connected, it achieved nothing, since the demon declared that it possessed limitless HP. Auriat was skeptical, so he attempted slashing the demon across the midsection, yet it had no effect whatsoever. The wound on the demon's body sealed itself almost immediately, not because the demon truly had infinite HP, but because it was siphoning Malphus's mana to regenerate, draining her energy at an alarming rate. The demon then remarked to Auriat and Yulia that they were rather impressive compared to the average humans it had encountered, but in the end, they remained no threat to it, and the same applied to all their allies fighting outside. No matter how desperately they struggled to defend the city, they would inevitably fall before the relentless tide of undead. Auriat firmly countered, declaring that none of his comrades would ever fall to a mere monster, but the demon replied that he could simply summon additional waves until they were utterly overwhelmed. Even the three battling outside the ruins wouldn't survive the next assault he planned to unleash, yet Yulia and Auriat were determined to prevent that outcome. The two of them launched a simultaneous attack, with Yulia severing the demon's head while Auriat drove his blade through its heart, but the demon nonchalantly retrieved his head and continued speaking. He announced his intention to massacre all the knights, then target the princess next, and for his own amusement, he considered sparing Yulia and Auriat, letting them live just long enough to watch Lieselot suffer a slow, agonizing death. Yulia was unwilling to let that fate unfold, yet she had no idea how to stop it. Nothing they did was working, and even Kurtz's magic crystals hadn't been enough to defeat the demon. At the same time, Malphus had resigned herself to her fate. Her strength was so depleted that even if she somehow escaped the magic circle, she wouldn't have the energy to flee. On top of that, thanks to the curse the bishop inflicted on her, she hadn't eaten any shit for several days, leaving her weaker and hungrier than she'd ever felt in her life. She silently wished she could experience the taste of Kurtz's cooking one final time before she passed, and she even began to hallucinate, because she was convinced she could hear Kurtz's voice calling out to her. But it wasn't a hallucination because Kurt and Lieselot had just broken their way into the chamber. Malphus was utterly stunned to see Kurt here, and even more astonished that he had brought the princess with him. Malphus suspected that Kurt had figured out she was somehow involved in the scheme to assassinate Lieselot, and that's why he brought the princess here, to make her witness firsthand. But in reality, Kurt hadn't even known Malphus was here until he arrived. Kurt then questioned Malphus, asking if she was the one targeting Lieselot, but Malphus explained that she had been expelled from the church and manipulated into this situation by Bishop Tristan. Kurt and Lieselot both heard her explanation, but their minds were processing completely different interpretations. Lieselot quickly realized that Tristan must be the mastermind behind all the assassination plots against her, while Kurt assumed Malphus had simply been scribbling everywhere because she was upset about being cast out. Malphus had no clue what Kurt meant, and neither did Lieselot, but regardless, Lieselot still supported whatever Kurt said, even if it didn't make any sense. Kurt then asked Malphus if she had any idea where Yulia was. Malphus didn't recognize the name Yulia, but she did recall spotting two adventurers making their way through earlier, so they were probably on the floor above this one. Kurt thanked her for the information and immediately turned to go search for Yulia, fully intending to leave Malphus behind, since he still believed the magic circle was nothing more than meaningless graffiti. However, Lieselot stopped him and asked if he could help clean up the magic circle while she went to find Yulia herself. Kurt tried to talk her out of it, warning that it would be dangerous for her to go alone, but Lieselot reminded him that he had given her a magic sword, so she'd be fine. Kurt finally agreed and let her go, and while Lieselot headed off, he somehow found a damn mop and a bucket and prepared to begin scrubbing. Malphus thought he had completely lost his mind, knowing full well that a magic circle couldn't simply be erased with plain water and a mop. But Kurt, oblivious to what impossible meant, casually wiped the magic circle clean. The moment the circle was broken, a demon instantly realized his mana supply had been severed, so he could no longer afford to absorb any more attacks. He quickly evaded as Yulia and Auriat launched their strikes. Neither of them understood what had changed, but the fact that the demon was dodging now meant it was actually afraid of being wounded. Yulia then reached into her bag for the last remaining magic crystal, determined to end the fight once and for all, but the demon knocked it from her hand before she could activate it, and without that crystal, their chances of victory grew thin. The demon was preparing to finally fight in earnest, but suddenly Lieselot appeared and called out to Yulia. Since Lieselot had been the demon's intended target from the start, it immediately drove its blade through her, killing her on the spot, then laughed at how reckless she was for coming here alone. However, to its shock, Lieselot's body dissolved into a swarm of butterflies, revealing that what it had slain was merely a decoy. The demon couldn't comprehend it, convinced it had struck down the real Lieselot, but what it attacked was nothing more than an illusion produced by the Sword of Confusion. As its name implies, this blade generates illusions capable of bewildering any foe, whether by showing disjointed, senseless images or, as in this case, creating a flawless replica of Lieselot. The demon attempted to kill Lieselot multiple times after that, but each strike simply passed through another illusion. And while the demon remained preoccupied with chasing these false images, the true Lieselot had quietly made her way to the magic crystal Ulyssia had dropped earlier. She then smashed the crystal, and the explosive surge of energy annihilated the demon completely. Since the demon had been the one sustaining the undead horde the moment it perished, all the monsters vanished as well. At last, the threat was eliminated, and the people of the city could finally breathe a sigh of relief, knowing they were safe. But Ulyssia was furious with Lieselot for putting herself in such danger. Lieselot apologized for coming without permission, but she confessed that she couldn't keep hiding while others fought to protect her. Ulyssia remained frustrated, yet she knew she had no real right to scold Lieselot. After all, had Lieselot not intervened when she did, both she and Ariad would have been slain by the demon. Ariad wanted to personally thank Lieselot for rescuing him, but she told him that wasn't necessary because he had fought with even greater resolve than she had. She thanked him for all his efforts in defending the city and promised she would reward him for his bravery. Meanwhile, Kurt had just finished erasing the last traces of the magic circle. But with the circle gone, Malphus' curse still lingered, preventing her from consuming any food, meaning it was only a matter of time before she succumbed to starvation. At that moment, Kurt offered her some of his lunch, recognizing how hungry she must be, and Malphus deeply appreciated the gesture. But if she were to eat it, the curse would simply force her to vomit it back up. Even so, she chose to eat it anyway, just so she could savor the taste of Kurt's cooking one final time before the end. But as soon as she takes that first bite, Malphus suddenly realizes she is able to eat it without any issue, and within seconds, the curse affecting her stomach fades away entirely. It doesn't take a genius to figure out that it was Kurt's food that lifted the curse. But this moment marks the first time Malphus truly comprehends what Kurt is capable of. Her mind drifts back to everything Kurt had done for her, and for the rest of the Flaming Dragon Party, and it finally dawns on her. The only reason their group had ever been strong was because Kurt had been supporting them from the shadows. Feeling genuine regret, she offers him a heartfelt apology for the way she had treated him in the past. Now don't get it twisted, Malphus is still kind of awful as a person, but at least she's finally recognizing Kurt's worth, and that's got to count for something. Of course, that doesn't spare her from facing the consequences, because two of Mimico's agents soon arrive to place her under arrest for her involvement in the assassination plot. Malphus calls out to Kurt for help, so Kurt simply assures her that he'll visit her in prison with food as often as she likes. After Malphus has been dragged off to prison, Lieselot approaches Kurt and asks if he's alright. Kurt responds that he's fine, and if anything, he's more concerned about Ulyssia and the others who had been fighting. But Lieselot reassures him that they're all okay, since they had each taken some of the healing soup Kurt had prepared. Once everyone returns from the battlefield, Kurt invites them all to a celebratory feast at the mansion. But after they sit down to eat, the soldiers remain silent, quietly devouring their meals without saying a word. Kurt starts to worry that maybe they're just forcing themselves to eat out of politeness since they don't seem particularly cheerful, but Ariad quickly clears up the misunderstanding. He tells Kurt that it's quite the opposite. They're silent because this is hands down the best food they've ever tasted, and they're focusing entirely on eating as much as they possibly can. Kurt is relieved and happy that they're enjoying the meal. While everyone continues eating, Lieselot calls Ariad over so she can officially introduce him to Kurt. Kurt recognizes him as the foreman who oversaw repairs on the city walls, but Lieselot explains that Ariad also serves as the leader responsible for governing the city and its people. At that moment, a series of fireworks light up the sky, leaving everyone in awe of the dazzling display. Kurt explains that he thought it would be nice to pair the meal with a show, so he had arranged the fireworks in advance. Speaking of the food, Ariad mentions that after eating, all of his injuries miraculously healed. But Kurt doesn't see what's so surprising about it. After all, back in his village, it was completely normal to recover after enjoying a good meal, and he can't believe that answer is even real.